this is exactly the question of how you leave the cave on your own. And here's the thing. The question of how you leave the cave on your own is the question of how you keep desire always perfecting, therefore never dying. You said it earlier. It's an extremely important point. Perfection is death.
Yeah.
If the human could be perfect, they die. Why is the dialogos conversation so engaging? Is there such thing as a perfect dialogos conversation?
Yeah.
Not really. There's a perfecting
Yeah.
dialogos conversation. The ing is everything.
Right.
The problem is we don't have any perfecting of desire. We only have perfect desire, obtain object, death. We have no practices of perfecting because we have no practices to keep desire desiring. And then, of course, people engage in what? A meaning crisis, because desire dies because they haven't been taught to incubate within themselves the ability to keep desiring, because the only way that the human can ever desire is to ever desire the mystery.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my wonderful conversation with O.G. Rose. More about that conversation in a moment. First, I have some announcements. First is, if you are interested in not just thinking about or listening to the ideas that we discuss on this channel, but have an interest in embodying them, living them, participating in them, through deep one-on-one work with me, or in fellowship with other people. You can do the one-on-one work with me by emailing me at guysengstock@gmail.com and just let me know that you are interested in talking about working together, and I will get back with you and schedule an exploratory session. We can talk through all the details about it. If you are interested in circling and diving into participating with the depth of these ideas in a non-propositional way, in an experiential, relational way, All Things Circling Institute is the place to go. We have drop-in events every Thursday evening at 6 to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We have weekend events every month to 6 weeks. And we have year-long training programs. We also have the latest recent edition of having downloadable courses. So you can now take the Explorer stage of circling and the Sovereign stage of circling, and a preliminary course, all downloadable online, such that you can do them and study at your own pace and can start right away. So all the relevant links for that are below in the show notes. All right. It's always a pleasure to talk with Mr. Rose, as I find him to be perhaps one of the most prolific thinkers that I know, perhaps have even met. He's got some pretty big runner-up, keep up with him pretty well, but he's definitely neck and neck, I would say, with 3 or 4 people that I've experienced in my life, and an incredible openness and warmth and relationality to him, and an openness to ideas, and incorporates them deep into his thinking. And I've just seen him do that over the last number of years that I've listened to him think. And recently, some things came together for him. Actually, I suppose it was a project of his that has really kind of came together, some final pieces of a book that he's writing, and an overall project that, this whole podcast is about that project and the depth of that project, which has to do essentially with revisioning education, basically from the ground up, from a completely different basis from which what we normally think of education as being, to what I think he would say is a more original origin of the human being, of our ontological sense. and chaining that, the very ground of that sense or that intelligibility up into all the levels of our living. And so we talk about all that and go deep into inquiry about it. I would say the first half of this was mostly getting caught up on his train of thought around this project, and then I would say somewhere maybe a little bit before the middle, we start to get into more of a dialectic, or as he would say, a rhetoric, which will be defined for you in the conversation. So, with no more ado, I welcome you to our conversation with O.G. Rose. Thank you. Hello, my friend.
Hello, guys. Oh my goodness, it is good to speak to you again. It's a pleasure.
It's been a few months, but I'm glad that we connected. I mean, one of the things, there's so many things that I want to talk with you about, right? But when we what had me kind of tap you was I happened to be listening to your the premiering of you and Mr. Lehman's most recent conversation, which I really thought was an amazing conversation, and then found out too that there was this kind of like a part of what was going on for you in that conversation was like you're getting some things just clicked into place of a project that you've been I guess that you've been working on for, or had in on the pipelines for 7 years or so, kind of clicked into place. But I think I sensed that in the conversation, it really drew something. It drew some a deep listening out of me, and a lot of things that I have been really thinking about, especially around like nihilism and some recent things that I've read, but one of the things that I was appreciating in the conversation, which was, I think you were talking about, basically how do we not like rerun Hitler and Stalin, basically, like how do we, what is that going to take, right, to not do that, right? And I think the thing I appreciated that you kept coming to is that, well, if it's something like the way that we conceptualize, we map, we have a sense for being, right? That if there's something that's given by being, or if we don't have a sense of things where something isn't given implicitly at some level by being, then all we got, right, is the most powerful guy and what he says, right, and then compliance. But if it's something where actually we look and we say, no, there's something like beauty, there's something like a profound lack/fullness, right, that there's something that it gives, that basis is upon which we can then create a government, we can do these kinds of things, that because it's implicit in the structure of being, if you will, or reality, or however you want to put it. If that's there, then there's hope of something other than Hitler, right? If not, then it's all construction, and it's like whoever's most powerful, blah 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 blah. But you kept returning to that sense of things in a way that I just really could appreciate, like that sense of it, because it seems to me that question is like, what the hell's going on with reality? Is there something, right? Is there something given, right? Intrinsic, right? That could be something like the basis upon which we can then create so many other things, right? If there isn't, what does that mean, right? But how we think about that and how we grapple with that just seems to be like one of the most important things that I can think about. And then then there was, I also wanted to talk with you about, so I wanted to talk with you more about that. I wanted to talk with you more about this sense of, this sounds like this project that has been coming together. What is that project? And this sense of, what you're talking about with Layman about evaluation, right? Education and something going on with that seems to be super prescient for you right now. Yeah, so those are all the things top of mind. And
Well, Mr. Guysengstock, that's outstanding. It's really good to speak with you. I always look forward to this. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for listening to that. Everything you said is spot on. I really appreciate it. So the project, so I wrote Belonging Again, Part 1 on the explanation 2016. And then I started the address in 2016. And then kept writing and writing and writing and writing. And, usually when I write something, what it is that I'll do essays.
Go back a little bit. So you said you started what in 2016
is Belonging Again, Part 1, which was the book that Layman and I talked about on Integral Stage, which is the sociological analysis of really the current moment in terms of given and releases, using a lot of Philip Reef, using a lot of Freud, a lot of in a way to sum up the book. Is the main idea is that human beings need a blend of givens and releases. If everything is possible, we tend to lose our minds because we can't make a choice. But if nothing is possible, we also lose our minds because we can't make decisions, because we're oppressed, right? And for most of human history, there were givens. And a given is a given because you don't think about it. It's just axiomatic. And so, for example, if you were born, say, in Virginia, like I am, you would 100 years ago and be Christian. It wouldn't be that you chose to be Christian. It would be that Christian was the case. It was given. It was just axiomatic.
Yeah.
And that led to a lot of existential relief, but it came with the risk of what? Being controlled, right? Someone comes in and manipulates you. And I'll talk about the banality of evil. So today, the world is defined by the collapse of givens. We don't have givens anymore. Nothing is given, which means that we're completely released. We have more freedom than ever before. But when humans have a lot of freedom, they tend to be miserable. They tend to be existentially overwhelmed. But now we have a problem because that means we have to somehow choose givens. But that, by definition, is a contradiction. You can't choose a given, but that is what is required. So if that's not possible, then we require some sort of, to use Hegel language, negation sublation of given, and something that's more like given like a gift. Something that's more like a gift given. This would be Belonging Again, Part 2. What does that look like? What is the socioeconomic structure that is going to address what the Part 1 is explaining? So, and that's the project that for all these years you're working on and gathering data and bringing these different papers. And honestly, guys, it's like 4,000 pages, but it's very scattered and you're looking for a through line. Where you're trying to kind of find the through line. And what came together is a very clear sense of the through line. Which is going to be a distinction, and I'll use some terms that may not be fully defined, but forgive me on it. And the distinction is going to be between rhetoric and discourse. And the reason why this distinction is very important is because we know from, say, the Frankfurt School postmodernists that, they all talk about how discourse structures us, right? Like we're structured by discourse. I think a good way to think about this is Kafka. In Kafka, which is different from Orwell and Huxley, people are oppressed not because of a direct power, but because the way their consciousness experiences reality structures them toward being oppressed. And that's how discourse works. You could also think of a book like Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction, where he talks about taste structuring consciousness. There's all these different things. Well, basically, if we are not able to engage with rhetoric, which we can associate with some of the stuff Layman and I were talking about, dialogos, circling, figuring out how to do circling, like we were speaking with Cadell and Tim, without transfer dynamics, how to honor the sort of where, like the nihilism that Rosen's talking about. So we have to learn the art of rhetoric to structure consciousness in order to avoid ending up like Kafka. Well, that changes everything, because the other key, the reason why I use the term rhetoric here, is because if we study Dietrich McCloskey and a lot of who, in my opinion, are the great economic historians, you literally see that the great enrichment of the modern world, the unleashing of creativity, invention, and all these things is a product of a change of how people talked. Pretty radical. And she makes this argument in her trilogy, and I think it's unbelievable, and it's very convincing. Literally, she argues that people changed how they thought about work. They changed how they talked about work, and it became dignified. and it actually had a morality about it. And in doing that, that changed how people were consciously toward work. And suddenly there was dignity in work, and you had an unleashing of innovation.
Yeah.
So rhetoric is the means that changes people's values, which then changes how they carry themselves in the world. And here's the issue. If we do not own our rhetoric, if we don't own rhetoric, then we slip into discourse and get structured like a Kafka novel and end up with Hitler. So this is a live problem. Like, if we don't own the practices that cultivate rhetoric, as I'm describing it, then we are going to end up in a Kafka novel, and we're going to end up, you know how like Jordan Hall, and they're talking about like slime it like game A, Molark, and how game theory dynamics structure us toward basically the meta crisis, right?
Yes.
That's exactly what will occur if discourse is not countered with rhetoric. So this is also an address to the game theory dynamics, which then game A, to use that category, in being that Nash equilibrium that they're describing, is the product of how discourse structures us if we do not own our rhetoric. And this is the key point. So by having that distinction, it helped me blend together, because there's a big examination of what demand is in economics. And what I would argue is that demand in economics is actually the same kind of nihilism that Rosen is talking about, or the apathetic center that circling is occurring, but it's the economic version of it. Now, that is a unbelievably massive claim that I would have to justify it, but if you let me make it for a moment. You know, so, and also then the very mechanisms of incubating and spreading rhetoric are also the very mechanisms by which we may master demand in economics and make it non-game A and actually start working toward a game B. So the question of rhetoric is the structuring of consciousness to avoid the game theory dynamics of the Nash equilibrium, to transform the way that we engage in economics, to transform the way that we engage in friendship, leisure, education, and all of these different things. But here's the key about rhetoric. Rhetoric works and is distinct from discourse by honoring something apathetic, by honoring something that is always beyond the frame of what can be calculated. And that's, you know, on the Rosen piece, the nihilism, the center, the thing that you're circling, the dialogos, the lack. You know, what's very interesting, and then I'll give it back to you, is that when you look at someone like Lacan, he's talking about a lack. When you look at some of the East Orthodox thinkers, they're talking about an apathetic. When you talk about some of the, there's this idea that there's something here that's trying to come forth. When you look at Martin Buber, there's something that's trying to come forth. In my opinion, all of this thinking, I'm not saying it's the same. That's not what I'm saying. But all of this thinking is tracing out the resources needed by which we can meaningfully practice a distinction between rhetoric and discourse. And if we can meaningfully practice that distinction, then we have the possibility of avoiding the game theory dynamics that lead us to the problematic Nash equilibrium. And also, if indeed economics, politics, because I would also argue that right now democracy is doomed because we don't have a distinction between rhetoric and discourse. All democratic exchange is structured according to discourse. Well, then it fails, of course. So this project is also this question of rhetoric, which I feel like the entire liminal web, I feel basically the entire liminal web is actually tracing a distinction between rhetoric and discourse, if we think about that as also the structuring of consciousness. This is also a question of basically saving democracy, if you will. That's a grandiose thing to say, but I think it basically is. It's also basically reorganizing the central principle of economics, and it's also making possible a space of leisure that transcends market forces and therefore cannot be captured. So the thing that clicked into place that helped bring together the address was the distinction between discourse and rhetoric. That if we can hold that distinction and then change all the socioeconomic institutions to incubate rhetoric over discourse, then you can start scaling a change that I think would be beneficial and positively consequential.
Totally. And so just to make this really clear, the difference between rhetoric and, like, if you were to bottom line it, like, what is the difference between the rhetorical or the rhetoric and discourse?
Very fair. A rhetoric is going to have an element of it that transcends conceptual ability. Discourse is entirely intelligible. So discourse, there is nothing. So another way to put this is when we look at someone like Julian Benda, who wrote The Treason of the Intellectual, he warned that colleges were doomed because they did not preserve a useless space, which was the humanities. If everything can be used, then everything can be calculated. Everything can be turned into a practice and controlled by the state or the system. So so it's also a defense of leisure. You see at the Stoa, Mr. Lindbergh will talk about leisure and the useless, and Joseph Piper will, and the need for that space. Rhetoric is honoring something that is always outside the frame of intelligibility, which actually means, therefore, there is always a final line of defense for the human. Because if there's always something that cannot be conceptualized, then the human is always safe in that uselessness. There is something about the human that cannot be reduced to mechanical forces. Rhetoric honors that. Discourse doesn't believe in that. Another way to put it is another term I'll use, although I hesitate to put out too much language because sometimes it can confuse, but I'll also make a distinction between high order causality and low order causality. And what I mean by that, low order causality, which is discourse, is when a billiard ball goes across the table and hits another billiard ball. Okay, it's causation, you can calculate it, you can do the formulas, F equals MA, so on and so forth. Discourse is a orientation to the world and speaking about the world as if everything can be calculated into low order causality. High order causality, which is honored and preserved in rhetoric, is belief of when a billiard ball goes across the table and it hits another one, and you remember that time when you played pool with your sister and you need to call her, so you call your sister, that's also a causal change, but it is not reducible to basic physics. That's what I call a high order causality. High order causality also describes most dialogos conversations, right? You find yourself talking about something unexpected, emergent. You can also associate rhetoric with emergence, high order, some of the forms of the apathetic. So so in rhetoric, it is a speaking and orientation to the world that preserves something that is always outside of what can be reduced to things that you can understand in low order terms.
Yes.
Whereas discourse is a worldview in which there is no space for that.
Yeah.
And so that's the distinction.
Okay, got you. Okay, got you. And just so we're clear, is like when all of the, because I know Aristotle did a bunch of work on rhetoric. Is there a similarity with the way he uses rhetoric and do you know, or?
That's a very fair question. One of the reasons I use the term rhetoric is because Dietrich Maclowski uses it to describe the making of the economic system is according to rhetoric. I also use it because I'm going to argue that the education system basically needs to train in rhetoric, as Aristotle talks about. And actually, even though Aristotle himself does not mean rhetoric like I'm using it, it's on the same gradient. It's the same skill set. So it's all related. Like basically as I was talking about with laymen, you take all this seriously. The school system suddenly is heavily in the business of oral ability, liminal web, dialogos, and rhetoric. That suddenly becomes central to education. And so what Aristotle is saying is not the same as Dietrich Maclowski, but it is in the skill set of what would make us better at what Dietrich Maclowski is talking about.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So basically, rhetoric is a way of speaking, conceiving, conceptualizing, being with, that holds open the irreducibility of certain things, right? And holds open in such a way that the higher order causation and these things can be preserved. And whereas discourse is more of a sense of, if it's only valid if it can be clearly explained, and so reduce everything down to its explanation and everything being directly intelligible in a first order sense of the word, but doesn't allow for essentially the ineffable to
absolutely
that's
not to interrupt, I'm so sorry, but definitely we can associate rhetoric with dialogos, we can associate it with prayer. I think in the liminal web spaces we're also seeing this issue of language where there are different terms to say different things. And I think one of the great skills of the liminal web is what I like to call the meta language skill, which is the ability to line up languages and see similarities. One of the reasons I like rhetoric is because it does have a historical, it has like a tradition that's kind of bound to it. It's also Maclowski's language. Also, there is a danger. I like it too because actually there's a danger in it. It could fall into mere rhetoric and then it's actually discourse. So there's always a reminder of a need to hold it so that it has
Right.
this ability of honoring it. And yeah, another way to look at how discourse works, we can associate discourse with also the zeitgeist, right? Like, so for example, if you tell someone you're reading Heidegger, what do they tend to say? Oh, are you in school? Oh, are you going to get a job? And you're like, no, I'm just doing it because I like it. Why? And there's this kind of sense that it's stupid. Like if you're reading Heidegger and it's not like part of anything, you're dumb, right? That is that's an example of a world that is ruled by discourse.
Yeah.
A world that was, say, run by rhetoric may look more like if I were where you say, hey, I'm reading Heidegger, and I say, oh, what you reading that for? Say, oh, because I like it. You would say, wow, how cool it is that you're reading something just because you value it for its own sake. That's actually noble and courageous.
Yeah.
Like that would be a world that reflects the values of rhetoric, where a world that reflects the values of discourse is one where if you can't plug it up to a job or whatever, you're irrational, you're wasting your time. The funny irony is, the great kind of Kafka joke is, a world in which everyone is practical is one that destroys the economy. Because it turns out what actually gives the lifeblood to the economy is intrinsic motivation, which creates demand that makes the entire lifeblood of the economy. So the great funny joke in all this is that the very effort to strengthen the economy is what has caused, I actually think we see in most Western nations, there's a certain point of wealth where you enter into a kind of stagnation, slow growth. Peter Thiel, Tyler Cohn, and even Keynes talk about this. It would make a lot of sense if wealth tends to create a tendency to only think in terms of discourse, which then destroys wealth creation. So one of the great ironies is that pragmatism is really bad for an economy, and yet we tend to think that it's good for an economy.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. So in this part 2, right? What is part 2 about? Right? Essentially, like if you were to spell out, kind of take this and like, okay, so how do we do this? What are some of the things you're finding yourself writing? And
that's a great question. So part 1, I try to start the entire thing asking the question, how does anyone leave Plato's cave? And the reason I start with that is because when you go back, a lot of people forget you're dragged out of the cave. So the hypothetical question I have is, how would you leave the cave if no one dragged you out? How is that even possible?
Yeah.
And for me, this is a really big question, because it's the question of, how do you create an internal drive? Like, how would you, if you were in Plato's cave and no one dragged you out, how would you know you were in Plato's cave? Yeah. And what are the conditions that, because here's the thing, if you say, well, someone has to drag you out, that runs the risk of totalitarianism, doesn't it?
Right.
It runs the risk of oppression. So if we want to avoid totalitarianism, we have to figure out how to inspire people by the cave itself to leave the cave. The cave has to have some sort of incubating principle in it that incubates the people within the cave to leave. Which, what does that even mean? So you start with, how does anyone leave Plato's cave? Which then, if you start with that, you say, what would a society look like that was able to inspire people to leave the cave indirectly, without someone dragging them out?
Yeah.
Well, that is all about an environment then. That is all about a Heideggerian clearing then. That is all about creating a kind of space in which people are so incubated. So it starts with that question, which then is associated with, for me, I try to read Plato and Nietzsche together. And the reason I do is because Nietzsche is a giant critique, in my opinion, of what I call beastocentrism. And what that is if you look at book 5 of The Gay Science, he's not just critiquing religion, he's critiquing pragmatism, science, nationalism as things bestowing upon you reason and motivation, like from an outside source. And the question is, how do you become without bestowing, or without bestowing being central? Well, that's internal motivation. That's internal. And so for him, in order to be a child, the third stage of the metamorphosis, you have to be able to create your own values. Well, how the frick do you do that? And how does that not lead to like anarchism? Well, now it's very clear that there are random individuals for random reasons who are able to be children. It is very clear that you have a scattering of people who are able to, on their own, become overmen, which is remember, like critically for Nietzsche, overman is not like power over, it's creative power. It's more aesthetic. It's more like a becoming sort of project. Yeah. So this is not a question on if people are children. The question is, can you spread the conditions of childhood, which is the conditions by which people leave the cave on their own? It is very clear that there are some people that for some reason that is hard to even describe are able to leave the cave on their own. The question is, can you systemize that on a large scale? If the answer is no, then there is no address to belonging again, part one. There is no address. There will simply be whatever happens will be whatever happens. Yeah. If the answer is yes, then we ought to spread those conditions or be aware of what those conditions are. So the book starts with a framing, and it will also talk about Cadell's extraordinary book on systems and subjects. It will also describe some of the questions of sort of the gymnasium. We had that talk with Lehman and Dimitri and Cadell on these different things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then what it has to do is establish the difference. So I can go through the whole book, I enjoy it. You're a saint.
Let's keep going.
You're a good man. So the next argument then has to establish, one, how would, it has to make the argument that economics is fundamentally a result of a dialectic between creativity and energy. And this is why. If you can show that the most fundamental principles of society actually are from something like childhood, then you could argue that the conditions of mastering that are actually good for the socioeconomic order that currently exists by its own standards. So suddenly you're not arguing to replace the current socioeconomic system with something entirely new. You're arguing that the system that currently exists actually is a product of childhood and has forgotten it. It's forgotten its own origin, per se. Andrew Luber would call this a devastating forgetting, and he's tying it with Heidegger. You've forgotten the very core that has made your possibility. So this is where then you have to go through the analysis. So part one of part two, and this is what's weird because there's a million parts, so forgive me, is an analysis of the debate between game A and game B, the Dark Renaissance. Peter, the Stoa had this, and also it has to describe a very important problem that I think is in the pretense of knowledge by Friedrich Hayek outlines, which is the problem of general knowledge versus particular knowledge, which is ultimately a massive problem for any project of scale. And what that is no matter how smart I am, I could be Albert Einstein, and unless I work at the McDonald's down the street, I don't know how many plastic forks they need to order next week, right? So there's a difference between general knowledge and particular knowledge. Right there is one of the most powerful arguments in the world against any project of scale. Because anything you scale, you're going to, by definition, remove yourself from the conditions of knowing the particular details that are needed to optimize those particular settings, and then you become oppressive. So we have to talk about Friedrich Hayek. Von Mises has another form of this, so Hayek's problem is called the knowledge problem. Von Mises is called the coordination problem. They're not the same. Von Mises is a bit more technical in human action, but I think the point is made, so I'll move on. Then there's another book that will be discussed called The Breakdown of Nations by Leopold Koh, which is a magnificent text. And what he argues is we think too much politically between left versus right. We need to think between up versus down. Because his argument is that any system, no matter how good it is at big enough of a scale, automatically fails. It's a compelling argument. So let's say socialism is better than capitalism. Well, on large enough of a scale, it fails. Let's say capitalism is better than socialism. On large enough of a scale, it fails. So he's like, we've got to stop thinking merely between left and right. We also have to think between up and down. Well, this is another massive argument against the possibility of scale. Because if it's the case that any program on large enough of a scale will fail, well, then whatever program we come up with to spread childhood would fail, right? Unless it is somehow different in its structure, and it's not so much scale as it is spread of a certain conditionality. So now there's another book called Scale by Jeffrey West that we have to go through that argues that there are laws of scale at a certain stage. He talks about cities and megacities. So we have to go through that. Then we have to argue through economic history to show that you cannot explain wealth in terms of things like capital accumulation, mere private property, science, and this is where Dietrich Maclowski is so important, where you show So my argument, so you go through that and you show that at the fundamental root of economic growth is a mystery, basically. Dietrich Mikowski calls it rhetoric. So for some reason, if human beings change how they think about something, the entire world changes, and it's called the Great Enrichment. So there's a mystery at the core of wealth.
Yeah.
Well, you take that seriously, then if you want to continue a great enrichment that is not pathological and destroying the environment and all that, then everything becomes about reattuning oneself to that mystery in terms of the socioeconomic order, not merely in terms of private habits. You have to then integrate that. But you see, that's then going to lead. So she has a big critique of Piketty, the book Capital, and a big argument he makes is we should have never called capitalism capitalism. We should have called it something like creativism, because capitalism does not create wealth by accumulating capital. That is a fallacy. You can go throughout the entire history of the world and not see wealth creation where there's capital accumulation. Wealth occurs when creativity and invention happens.
Yeah.
For me, what it actually unveils, then we have to do an analysis of demand. Like, what is demand in the general theory? And I would argue this is the main argument. When economists talk about creating demand, they're actually talking about stimulating demand. We don't even know what demand is, actually. Like demand, where does demand come from? It tends to just be pre-existing. Like it is just there.
That's the mystery.
That is the mystery. And if you look at demand, what you find out is that demand, which I think Keynes successfully argues, is the central concept of an economy. You can have all the supply you want, and if no one demands it, it will never turn into wealth. Demand is what transforms a phenomenon into a good. If I have this pen and you want it, it's now good for you. If you don't want it, it's just a pen. So demand, but then the question is the following. Why do you want this pen? What made you want it? Where did the want come from? You can say, oh, it was stimulated by the piece of paper. Maybe you want it because you have an idea for an invention that requires you to use the pen in the invention, right? Maybe there's some internal architecture that is the source of the demand. So I think I then try to argue that we can understand demand or Keynesianism as an argument that there's a demand event horizon, where if demand falls below a certain amount in the economy, it takes an extremely long time to recover. So we have to keep demand above the event horizon. But if we don't know what demand is, we're not going to be able to do that other than stimulating it. And do you know the main way that we stimulate demand right now? The main way is by creating materialism, by making people materialists. Wait a minute. That literally means the way that we are stopping a global financial crisis is by maintaining a spiritual devolution. We need people to not be spiritually advanced so that they are materialistically driven, so that they are consuming and maintaining demand, so that you do not have a financial crisis. Right now, the socioeconomic system, because it only knows how to stimulate demand, not how to create demand, has created an inverse relationship between the character and status of the subject and the well-being of the economy. That dynamic is, to me, getting a little, when I think about the critique of game A, like the problem of game A, because I would hesitate to make it sound, game A was able to solve the coordination problem that von Mises talks about. That nothing else has done that. So we can't throw out game A unless we have an answer to that, or we have to sublate it into something that has a different logic that is operating it. And that would be like, how do we sublate game A into a game B that doesn't erase game A, but is able to change the orientation of the principles of game A? To do that, you would have to know what demand is. Because if we do not know what demand is, which I would argue points at the fundamental mystery, and then I'll close my point for now, then we cannot untangle the inverse relationship between spiritual status and keeping us above the demand event horizon, that if we fall below, the global financial system fails. So those were the stakes. I'll pause for now.
Yeah, totally. So there's basically, like, essentially what you're saying is like that the difference that makes the difference here is that rhetoric allows for mystery. In fact, it sees it as central in some way. And that there's this deep connection between innovation, right, and creativity, which is also the source of wealth, right, and economic flourishing. And that the central mystery that we don't understand completely is desire. What is desire? Why do we desire? What is can we choose like what we desire? Can we not choose it? What's the difference that makes a difference with desire? But if we have a sense of that, right, in such a way that preserves the mystery, that then we're going to start to be able to get a sense of on how to scale, right, in a way that doesn't lead to Hitler and Stalin, right? That realizes the intrinsic, the intrinsic mystery that our consciously rhetorically trained consciousness can live, that births it. That there's a way of doing that, but we don't know how to do that because we don't know what desire is. And we live in a world of discourse, which basically says it's only real if you can like basically explain it and reduce it down to its component parts, and that makes sense. If it doesn't, it's just not. We don't acknowledge that it exists, right? So right now, the only solution is given that is just to stimulate more desire, which is basically calling on society to become, like stout materialists, at the same time telling them to reduce their carbon emissions, right? Yeah. Therefore, that's why everybody's looking kind of somewhere as this like strange look on their face, where they're somewhere between like constipated and yes, something else. Mm-hmm. Right.
That was really well put. That was extremely well put. If we do not know what desire is, or where it comes from, or what it's seeking, because maybe desire is not even captured by the word desire as we traditionally associate it. Yeah. Maybe it's something more like the book will also talk about the very critical part where in book 7 of the Republic, where Plato's describing the forms, and he describes it more like the trajectory of a planet in orbit. It's the trajectory, it's the movement that gives it its formulation. For Plato, forms are always formulations. Yeah. They are the formulating principle of thing. And what if desire is indeed the seeking of that formulation? Yeah. Well, then the question would be how, and it's difficult. One of the reasons why it's difficult to talk about desire is because we bring with it all the connotations in the word of the zeitgeist. So desire is sexual, or it's like want, and it's kind of simplistic, right? Yeah. So like a way to think about desire is there does seem to be many layers of desire. And I'll come back to this because this is getting at the central mystery. Does the word desire capture our relationship with beauty? Do you desire beauty? Yes. But then it's not the same kind of desire as chocolate. When you desire chocolate, right, do you desire chocolate in the same way you desire beauty? Yeah. It seems as if we're using the same word as a culture, but there's something else in the second form. Yeah. That actually functions to conceal us from understanding desire. Because if you say, oh, desire is what runs the show, people go, great, we'll give them chocolate. And it's like, no, that's not addressing, that's where you end up stimulating desire, not creating desire. Yeah. And that changes everything. Everything you said was extremely well put. And I'll also note, if the only things that are allowed to be discussed are the things that you can explain in terms of low order causation, and desire somehow at its peak form involves high order causation, then you are only allowed to discuss desire in terms of low order causation, which means getting chocolate. You're not allowed to discuss, or it's unintelligible to discuss desire, which is a seeking of a relation with beauty. That's cut out of the modeling. That's cut out of the education, because here's also the main issue. If we take all this seriously, as we were describing with Mr. Pascal, with the great layman Pascal, is that of course this would all have insanely consequences for education, because if being educated is about creating the conditions of rhetoric, not answering the trivia questions of discourse, then the classroom has to become the creation of a clearing that allows people to master rhetoric. And I think it gets into what Mr. Rosen in his book on nihilism is getting at, like nihilism as a forcing upon, if this is a nihilistic age, it is an age where the question of the nothing is forced upon us. Is it nothing as an effacement, or is it apathetic? To me, that ultimately becomes what I call the absolute choice. We have to choose if the nothing is nothing as in a kind of black hole, or is it nothing because it's infinitely pregnant and it seems like nothing because it always transcends the frame. Well, guess what?
Does the whole have a W at the beginning or not? Yes.
That is the choice. That's 100%. We love like the whole hope paper we talk about. Like, do we have like whole hope or whole hope, right?
Yes.
You know, so it's, you know, that's good. Right now, the education system makes us toward nothing as a black hole. And in the trivia structure, as I call it, which basically the structure of the classroom following Neil Postman and teaching a subversive act, moralizes learning as being good with trivia. That you always have the answers to the question that the teacher has. This gives you no skills to approach the void as apathetic. When you approach the void doesn't give you an answer, so you don't know what to do with it. You're waiting for the teacher to give you the answer to the trivia question. The void never does, so you fall into the meaning crisis. So you fall into bad nihilism. But if the classroom instead, in its structure, created a moral association that actually being able to honor and to surround and to participate in the void, well, then suddenly it would be opened as apathetic and it would be a creative source. And suddenly the nihilism that has led to the meaning crisis would be the nihilism that leads to the meaning of dress. Like the very cause of the crisis is the thing we have to change our relation to make it an address. Nihilism is the horizon of the age. You can't get rid of it, but you can change its character. And I think that's what Rosen is suggesting in his book, is that nihilism, like, you know, at the beginning, when he describes that nihilism is where everything is permitted, right? He's using that kind of question, that kind of framing, instead of like, he says he's going to go with that instead of the Heidegger framing. Well, the funny thing about everything is permitted, why is it that there's something we can't put into words if everything is permitted? Like if everything is permitted and yet every time we talk, we find ourselves unable to say something. Why is that? Because I thought everything was permitted. Well, this is the revelation. If everything is permitted on the surface, per se, and yet we're still incapable of saying certain things, there must be a better structure that's keeping us from saying those things. Therefore, there is an underwriting logic to reality that the act of trying to make everything permitted unveils is there in our inability to speak it, which then shows there's an art and practice to be mastered of trying to speak better the thing that cannot be fully conceptualized. And if it cannot be fully conceptualized, it must be there. And if it is there, it must be apathetic instead of nothing in a negative sense.
So it's kind of like what you're saying. It's kind of like how we make this choice about the nothing being a not versus a fullness, let's say, has to do, it's a choice. Is it something like, I got this as you were talking about it, there's something about like, oh, I could begin to notice that I get to the edge of that sentence and I can't say the thing anymore. But I have to notice that I was approaching something, right, that can't be said. Wait a minute, it's not just a void, there's something structuring, right, that has me attempt to say it in the first place. What is that attempt? Yeah. And that thing, and desire. Yes, this isn't really interesting because one of the things that about the how clearly Rosen kind of broke this down about his interpretation of Plato, especially like the Republic, is this sense of, I like the way where he looked at it, is like saying that the human being is essentially a paradox between between speech and desire, right? And and he goes on to say, he says, like, well, what's interesting, what ends up being the case is that you think you actually need language to articulate what you want, right? And so actually what's weird is you end up wanting speech, right? But at the same time, there's the world, the world that isn't speech, right? It's like you need speech to articulate it, such that like the more refined your speech is, the more the particular thing that you can disclose to then want and then have. But the human beings, this is what I liked what he said, is like but what it is to be a human being is to desire perfection. But if you fulfill that desire, you're no longer human. Right? So it's this weird, it's a strange paradoxical situation where that if you accomplish the thing that you most want, you stop being human, essentially. And that I thought he did an amazing job at like articulating the different ways, the different ways that he talked about, like, well, what happens when you go all speech, right? Or you go all desire, and you just watch that play out in these different, like, in Heidegger and Nietzsche and Marx, and all these different ways where he kind of took that sense of things where like the bottom up or the top down, where in some sense they were trying to solve for the missing of the two of them coming together. So there's something about, like, the whole two worlds mythology of where you need the emergence, and you also need the emanation, right? You need both of those. And that like, if you try to reduce one without the other one, it always ends up hijacking the thing, right? But that's really hard. And I think what I'm hearing you say, as I'm talking about it with you, I think what I'm hearing myself say in response to you is that it sounds like that there's something about this desire that seems to be the central thing upon which it turns, and that there's this thing called rhetoric, which seems like something like the right way of using speech, that one has you articulate the perfection upon which you want in such a way that has you get as close to it as possible, but yet keeps you a proper distance, since you keep being a human being, right? And so there's also this element of, like, where he talks about, well, if all speech goes to silence, then it's just mute, right? So there's this kind of there's this place where, like, desire and speech come together to this certain point, but they have this relationship where they don't ever totally touch each other in some way, but they require each other. And we seem to be right in the center of that.
You put it all so well. So a few things come to mind.
I think I applaud Mr. Rosen when he makes the point, speaking about Wittgenstein, where there's this idea in Wittgenstein that philosophy must follow ordinary language. Like, because, like it has to be situated in ordinary language. And for a lot of people, it's like, oh, well, you can kind of get rid of philosophy by following ordinary language. He's like, well, wait a minute. What is ordinary language doing? And if it's actually trying to approach a lack, then actually ordinary speech becomes a massive argument that philosophy is about that lack, as opposed to, like if we were to use Wittgenstein's idea of climbing the ladder and kicking it away, philosophy then becomes, okay, well, what does it mean that the human being uses speech to get to a place where they can kick a ladder away? Like there is actually a horizon of philosophy about the fact that speech gets you there. And then the question becomes, why is that? Why is the human being like that? Because the trajectory of ordinary language is to get to the place where eventually something unspeakable is said. Well, then philosophy is about the unspeakable thing, right? And yet that means philosophy at its very core is somehow paradoxical. And yet in that paradox, it improves. This is the key. If everything is permitted, perhaps that is true, just not all at once. Maybe we can get better at saying the unspeakable, and it's permitted to get better and better, but it has to be through a lifetime, and there's always going to be a lot that we don't get to. But if everything is permitted, it might just be that it can't be permitted all at once. I think the other critical thing, or in its entirety, right? Like it's theoretically possible that everything is permitted, but everything is so much more than a human's finite lifespan that practically speaking, they never get it. Therefore, the mystery is preserved, even though it's accessible. And this is, I think, the possible middle ground where you talk about there being an infinite mystery, and yet it's accessible in its totality, but not for finite human beings, because it is infinite and thus beyond the time horizon of what any human can access. And right there, you start then talking about something inexhaustible that is not cut off. And that's what we have to find the middle ground. And I think that's what a lot depends on today. So the other thing that's so important with what we're saying here is that I think like the whole everything is permitted from the brothers Karamazov is terribly misunderstood, because the character that originally says this is not Alyosha, but Ivan Karamazov. He says it earlier about something with values in chapter 1. The reason why this was important is because it's the same character who then later on is like, I turn in my ticket because God lets all this horrible stuff happen to children. Wait a minute, Ivan. You're the one who said everything was permitted. And you know darn well that's not true. You see, the reason Dostoevsky is such a genius is because he uses ideas and locates them. He locates conflicting ideas in the same character. That's why Dostoevsky is different from everyone else. Everyone else tends to have other ideas represented in other characters. What Dostoevsky is, let me take super powerful ideas and put them in the same mind and see how they live with that. And so here's the key with Ivan Karamazov. He knows that everything should be permitted, and yet he knows it's wrong for children to be killed. And so he has to believe a God exists of who he can't imagine exists. So another way to look at this is Ivan has a sense of a metastructure because he just knows it's wrong for children to be killed like this. But he cannot rationally deduce it. So there's a kind of intuition that Ivan cannot shake off. So Rose, there's a kind of intuition. And that intuition, which is a very mysterious term that is brought up in Jung, it's brought up in Bergson, he brings it up in his book. There's some sort of sense of an intuition that this is not right and I cannot explain it, and yet it's somehow metastructurally the case. It is beyond human conceptibility. So that means everything is permitted. This is the thing. Nihilism becomes the clearing of everything that could provide plausible deniability that there isn't a metastructure. Because if everything is permitted, and yet you still have an intuition that children shouldn't be suffered, that means there must be something beyond that which the everything that you can understand. There must be an everything beyond everything, per se, right? Because otherwise, you wouldn't be bothered by children being murdered. So this is what the reason why Ivan starts losing his mind in the book is because he knows he is holding two ideas that can only be the case if there's a dimension beyond that which he understands reality. Therefore, a God of whom he wants to turn his ticket back in. But if that God takes the ticket back in, he's lost the grounds to think children should not suffer. Right? So likewise, nihilism then, where everything is permitted, then becomes an opportunity to say, hey, human beings, if everything is permitted, why is it that you don't seem permitted to put everything into words? Why is it that you don't seem permitted to find the object of your desire? That's weird. Why is it that speech tends to lead desire to something that it cannot fully capture? Yeah. Wait a minute. Maybe there's some metastructure beyond all of our categorization that is actually giving you those intuitions that you know is there, that you spend your entire life trying to get better at.
Yeah.
So everything is permitted, then becomes the opportunity to realize everything's permitted, and yet there's something more.
Right.
Oh,
right.
And yet I can, and then this is the key to, and then I'll give it back to you. The function of speech is to bring you to the place where you no longer have plausible deniability, that there isn't an everything beyond the everything, because you've spoken everything to the place where you say, yes, everything's permitted. I've spoken it thus. I've said everything that can be said. There's nothing left to be said. I've spoken it, and yet I hit something.
Yeah.
And yet I hit something, and now I can know, here's the key. Because I have said everything, the function of speech is the removal of the plausible deniability that there isn't something unspeakable. If you could not speak, you could always plausibly deny that there was an ineffable, because maybe it's not ineffable, you just haven't said it yet. Do you understand? But if you say everything, if everything is permitted and there's still something ineffable, then it truly is ineffable, not merely a matter of not finding words for it yet.
Yeah.
And the reason it is truly ineffable is because it transcends the finite horizon of what we can realize within our timescape, because it is a mystery that is always transcended of use, because it is ultimately useless, because the human cannot fully render it into the order causation.
Right. Seems, I mean, one of the things I'm noticing is, as we're talking about this, is that every time we bump up against the mystery, right, or the thing that can't be said, or said yet, that attention keeps wanting to go. It keeps wanting to look at it.
Yes.
This link between the mystery, the unspeakable, the unsayable, and attention, a human desire. Well, it's another way of saying that. Yeah, is that I can't help but desire to look towards the thing that I can't quite see, the thing that's transcendent. So it's like, in some way, I say everything that I know to say, and then somehow someone notices it, like, oh, wait a minute, but there's still you attempting, that you can't account for this part, like, oh shit, there's more. Now the question is like, what I heard you say is, that's not just that's a real ineffable, right? That's a real inexhaustible, right? Because it's not, you made that distinction, it's not just, what do you say? It's not just, what did you say? It was like, it's not just that I haven't said it yet. Instead, what did you make? There was a distinction you used there.
Oh no, it's very fair. There is a mystery that you could theoretically speak the entire, but you couldn't practically ever do it, because it always transcends the finite limit that you have. So it's a kind of practical theoretic distinction. Yes. Like theoretically, I think the mystery is something that if you say lived 1 trillion years or whatever and were God, you could speak. The issue is that no human being matches that. So practically, it is ultimately ineffable. But it is not. The key is we have to make a distinction between a closed ineffability and an open ineffability.
Yeah.
And that's what we haven't had in our thinking. Like what we are describing is, if you make central this mystery and you understand it as an open ineffability, an inviting ineffability, well, then you can make your classroom about it. Then you can make your economy about it, because it's open. We just got to get better at it. And so arguing for the structure of this ineffability as having an open quality, but it's only inexhaustible because it is practically inexhaustible, not theoretically inexhaustible, then it's not crazy. You know, it's within the scope of human possibility, just not ultimately.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Because that's the tricky move between theoretical and practical that then opens the door for an entire socioeconomic reformation around it.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. That does make a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that's striking me is just, too, is it is strange that on some level, like what I end up, what I mean, this is even true erotically, right? Of in some sense, when something's unattainable, when something's can't ever be completely uncovered, it's that just a little bit of its covering, its concealment, right, is where desire always wants to go. Like desire and the mystery seem to be really, 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 really
Yes.
close,
Yes.
right? Really, really, really close.
Yes.
Like almost, it's almost as if, like it's almost as if, like when the mystery or the ineffable shows up, it's almost as if like everything stops and all the animals like tune in, like as if there was something like waiting and listening for that the whole time, right? Like whether or not you're conscious of it or not, there's something. It does have that quality that the mystery, that there's something in us, that there's an ear that's open to the mystery, kind of like 24/7, such that if it was a whisper in a crowded fucking conference, right? Like I would hear it, right? There's something like listening for that. And what is that? I guess the question is like, there was a bunch of questions in there. It's like, what is this connection between attention, attending, and the mystery? Like what is that? Is it a sense? Is it a matter of if I get close enough to that mystery and attention, is that I'll realize that like, oh, well, attention is that mystery, that there's something that kind of like inverts there. And like, I'm like, it's like attention is looking at itself, or awareness is looking at itself, or something like that. Right.
That's all really good. So
There's a few things. First, one of the reasons why like Lacan and psychoanalysis is very useful here is because we can understand the subject as structured by desire. And when you look at that structure, you see some sort of dusting, some sort of otherness that the subject dies without. So psychoanalysis can help us model this. The next thing is there's a sense where the thing we can't say is the thing we don't know that we might say next. Like the ineffability is, and then it's not because you say it. But then as soon as you say it, a new ineffability is there, and a new thing, and a new thing, and a new thing. Like a relation to the ineffability is like you're in a dark forest with a lamp. But as you go through it, everything behind you is forever illuminated. Yeah. But there's more to go through. And your experience of the darkness is not one of horror, but of excitement. Because you know you have the lamp. And wow, we're going to see what's next. Like I said, dark forest, and that connotes all these kind of scary images. But it's more like, oh my gosh. We're like, because what you illuminate is not like a dead forest, but it's Narnia. Basically, like that's kind of the difference. And so a lot of times the thing that we can't say is the thing that we might, not will, but might say next. Yeah. And one of the reasons we keep trying is because we know that we have to try for that thing to maybe be said. And if we stop, it won't be. So you're always temporarily creating you have to create the conditions that it's a temporal thing. You have to temporally allow the becoming, but if you stop speaking, it can't become. Like it can't happen. Yeah. So the speaking always has to keep trying. It's the same with art. The painting you can't paint is the one that you might paint next. Yeah. The music that you might produce next is it's always the thing that might in the failure. Yeah. The failure and the might is always there. The creative act is structurally this thing that the thing that's not here is the thing that might be here a moment later. And so it always you know how we were saying earlier, it's like the formulating principle, like the meteorite. You are actively creating the path that you are following in the speaking. And then the question is that path arbitrary, or is it the revelation of something more? And that's the absolute choice. You then get to choose on if that creation of that path is participating in something larger than the human condition, maybe even theological if you want, alterological, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You make that choice. But the structure comes out for the subject in a certain mode of conversation, in a certain mode of creativity that the education system moralizes you not to do.
Yeah.
Because it moralizes you to do trivia. It moralizes you to know what you're going to say next. It moralizes you not to create anything except what the teacher is going to approve of. Therefore, the structure of discussion and creation in school must be discourse, not rhetoric. And then here's the thing. Do you know what desire seeks? Desire without high order causation dies. Okay? So desire that only has low order causation ceases to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
The current socioeconomic system can only stimulate desire, which means it can only generate desire through low order causation. A human being without desire suffers a meaning crisis. The meaning crisis is profoundly linked to the desire crisis because we only know how to desire in terms of low order causation. We have a socioeconomic order that stimulates desire. So as a result, desire dies because desire eventually reaches its object. It gets what it wants, and it turns out that that thing doesn't fulfill it. So then desire either becomes materialistic and, you know, pathological and always looking for new objects, or it gives up hope and it becomes nihilistic. Because to lose meaning is to lose motivation, it's to lose desire.
Yeah.
And so the meaning crisis is all kind of on the gradient of a desire crisis, a motivation crisis, and all of these different things. Because desire dies without high order causation. And high order causation, this is the key. Desire must cause for itself something that is high order, so then it can desire that and always have a thing that it is desiring that is changing its character in the act of unfolding. Another way to describe this, let's just look at conversation. A conversation, let's use dialogos.
Yeah.
Low order conversation can never be dialogos.
Yeah.
That is what makes that is the difference. High dialogos, where the mystery and all the emergence occurs, is conversation that's high order. It follows a logic that is not reducible to the back and forth of merely the information. It becomes the creating of a condition where something greater than the part comes out.
Yes.
So conversation without high order conversation plus high order causation becomes rhetoric, ergo dialogos.
Yeah.
And we all know that basically conversation that doesn't become dialogos kind of sucks. Or it doesn't suck, but it's just exchange, right? And one of the whole ideas of the liminal web is the thinking about conversing and fellowship that has this high order principle. High order conversation, dialogos is rhetoric.
Yeah.
Without high order, it dies. That logic I just told you about conversation is exactly the same structure as desire. In Lacan, the subconscious is structured like a language. Like language and desire are two sides of the same coin. So the structure of conversation, of which requires high order to keep itself alive, and then it feels like it can go on forever, right? People say it all the time. Man, where did the 3 hours go? Where did the time go? And at the end of the conversation, you feel like you got something, and then it also is like, what did I get? I can't put it into words. It's beyond you. Yeah. If you want to stop the meaning crisis, you must create that condition for desire. Desire has to have the same structure of going through a kind of, oh my gosh, I got what I wanted, but I didn't. There's still something else to desire, and I'm changed forever by it. And it goes on and goes. We have created a socioeconomic order that does not make that possible for desire. And as a result, desire has died. And as a result, people have a what? Meaning crisis. They're not motivated, which then is destroying demand. And when you destroy demand, you destroy the economy.
Yeah.
And so the very, very effort to avoid an economic collapse is creating the conditions of its collapse. And the only way to change that, the only way to stop that, is a return to the very rhetoric that calls the great enrichment in the first place, which would be making central the mystery out of which it all comes. And how do we create a school system, a city, spaces, everyday practices of life, so that we might get better at it and thus unfold that great enrichment in terms of soul and in terms of prosperity and in terms of materiality. That would require changing the character of desire to something high order and therefore of the image and likeness of dialogos. And that's what we can do.
Yeah. You know, there's something about it's also really interesting to look at like how different religions look at desire. None of them are neutral about it. they're all like, your relationship with desire is like kind of
Everything.
like the way it turns, right? So that I think that's really telling. But one of the things that I got, and I don't know if this is what was meant explicitly by Buddhism or the Buddha, but I did my first experience of meditating was a 10-day Vipassana retreat, and so it's basically like, it's a really cool thing. It's the whole thing's nonprofit. Like, go up there, you don't talk to anybody. It's a vow of silence. You basically, I think you sit and meditate, I think 11 hours a day, if you do all the sits, with no communication going on for 10 days straight. And what's interesting is they basically kind of remove all of the possibility of all objects of your desires, right, are like removed. And so you kind of basically go on this ride. And my sense of it was something like, although people talked about it, like I somehow got okay with not having, not talking to my neighbor. Like, I really desired to talk to my neighbor. I really wanted to talk with them, find out this thing. And then over and over and over again, I noticed that desire, and then I let it go, and I stayed sitting. I noticed and I let it go. I stayed sitting. You know, on one level, you could talk about that as you say, well, getting better at that, right, is like, well, I actually stopped. I became a quantumist. I no longer desired that. But I think what I got a sense of it was that doesn't explain all of it, right? My sense was that when you remove the fixation of the object of the desire, what you're actually doing, and especially in meditation, because it was so just like continually present, is you actually, as you let go of that desire, you actually unfolded back into more of the source of the desire.
Yes.
And that the enlightenment was this kind of shining forth of where awareness or attention or perspective or comportment, however you wanted to call that, was somehow closer to its own source there. And yeah, that's, what would you make of that?
That's excellent. Desire
Tends to attach to objects and become low order when it is externalized.
Yeah.
And to some degree, it must be externalized. There's no way to avoid this risk. You're in an external world. Like, all of this would be a lot easier if you didn't have to deal with the external world. And that's actually kind of the temptation. Like, how do I just avoid the world, right? I can be a Nietzschean child if I don't have to like go down to the town like Zarathustra does or something like that, right? So the issue is that desire seeks to attach to an object. But the problem is, once it does that, it's then convinced that if I get that object, I'll fulfill my desire, and then it's disappointed. And if you do that long enough, then desire dies.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of like if you keep doing something and it doesn't work, you enter into despair, and now you have a meaning crisis because you don't have motivation, right? So you have to learn how to keep your desire from attaching to objects in a way that then makes you believe that is the point of the desire. That's the transition. You can never let an object that is in the path of desire become the point of desire. Yeah. And it's natural for us to make objects of desire the points of desire. But it's possible to say, go get ice cream and it not be the like point of desire. You're just doing it because ice cream's nice.
Yeah.
So it's on the path of your trajectory, your formulation, but it is not the point of your formulation. And often, in order to get to the place where one is capable of that, you have to learn to bring desire to the source and not let it extend into the world, but from the source. So here's another way to put this. Economics treats demand as if it's just there. It's just pre-existing. There is no source. Chetan said it's like a rumor. A rumor doesn't have an origin. It's just there. We're just going to muddle demand. Never let your desire be something that exists like a rumor. Don't let it just be there. Make sure that if that ice cream is in your path, that it is not the object of desire. It's simply on the path of your desiring. That way, you can enjoy the ice cream and it not be the point. But this is going to require, at some points in people's lives, a practice of drawing the desire all the way into the source, so that then from there it can go back into a new extension as a path that is its own pathing, as opposed to looking for a point. Since we as human beings start with desire already extended, then we already start in a place where we need to withdraw it back in. And that's why that tends to be a necessary practice. The other, and this gets to what the great Layman was saying on evaluation, you also have to learn to be able to evaluate when you're not talking to your neighbor from a place of discipline or from a place of anxiety. Because in one scenario, not talking to your neighbor is a vice, because you're not talking to them because you're anxious and you're therefore not facing your fear. But from another circumstance, you're avoiding the temptation to escape the void or to escape the place of the source, right? So it would look like you were engaged in a virtue when you talk to your neighbor, but actually in that context, you would be avoiding the practice of going to the source and therefore would be a vice. Well, the action is exactly the same, not talking to the neighbor. So how do you tell the difference? The evaluation. Well, guess what? If so much of this transformation of the subject requires these very fine differences between not talking to the neighbor as vice and not talking to a neighbor as virtue, we're probably going to need to teach that. We're probably going to need to train that. And we have an education system that's teaching people a bunch of facts that they're going to forget by the time they're out of school. I would really think. So this is the other big thing from the talk. So everything we have said suggests that the human is optimal in coming to basically have a different kind of desire. That is a desire to find fittedness with the mystery. Let's just use that language for now. I think it's fair.
Fittedness with the mystery. Great.
Yeah, fittedness with the mystery. Well, right now, the school system, because what Neil Postman tells us is that the medium is the message, that the education system is basically more important in its structure than it is in its information. What does the schoolroom currently tell you? That a smart, educated person is good at trivia. Random questions, you answer the question first, you have the test. So an educated person is good at trivia. Well, then a stupid person is someone who gets good at evaluating the difference between speaking with neighbor as virtue and speaking with neighbor as vice. That's not a good use of time. That's actually an irrational use of time. If you want to spread the ability to evaluate those differences, then you're going to need to change the medium of education to stop implying that being good at trivia is what constitutes education. And I'll give it back to you, but in regard to education, you have to change what is taught in the class. We can't merely plug philosophy into a trivia structure. That's not going to do it. You have to change the structure to be more like a Heideggerian clearing so that then people can exist in the clearing to explore those evaluations and get better at those skills. And until the classroom changes in that structure, you will continue to have an indirect ethic of not engaging in those abilities because it's ethical to get good at trivia, not to get good at telling the difference between a vice of not talking to your neighbor and a virtue of not talking to your neighbor. Right now, the school system indirectly says it's virtuous to be bad. It is basically a virtue to be bad at evaluation. You shouldn't be evaluating. You should be repeating. If you're evaluating, you're a trouble kid. So why are you evaluating? So the school system therefore creates an ethic around education that is the exact opposite of what we need to honor the apathetic. And no wonder then that people are choosing their relation to the nothingness in terms of a negativity that causes a meaning crisis, as opposed to an opening of a horizon of ever perfecting.
Wow. So basically, we're kind of back to the you're kind of this last thing that you just went into. Sounds like we're back into that question of how do we in our educating, how do we educate people to want to leave the cave, essentially,
Yes.
right? Without dragging them, right? How do we awaken that within the cave, right? And so, yeah, go ahead.
Not to interrupt, that's exactly right. That because it's going to start with the classroom.
Yeah.
There's a few things. You return to oral tests, you get rid of written tests, you return to a training of rhetoric, you were trained to colleges, like, why are we doing discussion structures in colleges and not in high school? It's as if we know indirectly that discussion structures are better for education, and yet we reserve them only for the people that get into college. And then we wonder why people sit around and watching TV. Well, I don't know. The majority of people were never put into an environment where they could engage in discussion to do anything but consume something. And then also, unfortunately, too often the discussions in colleges are just saying what the teacher wants you to say, as opposed to the teacher being a shepherd of being, shepherding a discussion to disclose something that's unknown ahead of time, because we're not there to discuss. The problem is discussions in colleges too often are structured to discuss what, like, the philosopher said according to the professor, as opposed to entertaining the mystery. But the point is, at least in colleges, you see a discussion structure. So there's a lot of a return to oral. There's different things like that. But I interrupted you. But no, this is exactly the question of how you leave the cave on your own. And here's the thing. The question of how you leave the cave on your own is the question of how you keep desire always perfecting, therefore never dying. You said it earlier. It's an extremely important point. Perfection is death.
Yeah.
If the human could be perfect, they die. Why is the dialogos conversation so engaging? Is there such thing as a perfect dialogos conversation?
No.
Not really. There's a perfecting dialogos conversation. The ing is everything.
Right.
The problem is we don't have any perfecting of desire. We only have perfect desire, obtain object, death. We have no practices of perfecting because we have no practices to keep desire desiring. And then, of course, people engage in what? A meaning crisis, because desire dies because they haven't been taught to incubate within themselves the ability to keep desiring, because the only way that the human can ever desire is to ever desire the mystery. That's the only thing that can be an infinite source of intrinsic motivation. And if the mystery, therefore, is not the center of education, don't be surprised when people are just materialistic or they don't care to desire anything, because all there is to desire are counterfeits of the thing they really want, which is the ever desiring found in a fittedness to the mystery. But we have denied that to people in the structure of education. And in fact, we have implied in its medium a moralization of the not doing that. We've actually moralized the engagement of discourse instead of the engagement of rhetoric. And the more a nation becomes a first world nation, ironically, the more it is prone to do this, thus cutting itself off from the rhetoric that made it wealthy in the first place. And that's why I think first world nations tend to fall into stagnancy, just like Keynes, Tyler Cohn, and all them talking about why there seems to be a reduction of growth rates, because they create the conditions that make them forget how they got there.
Yes. 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 Totally. Totally. You know, now I'm noticing my attention keeps it's circling around. It's circling around this sense of like, yeah, it's something like in those places where I've seen in myself and other people and watching people like learn how to circle and all the different levels of education, like where have I seen this perfecting of desire, right? Like looking at it through that frame, this perfecting of like holding close at a distance. There's like an intimacy thing going on there. It's not merging. It's like there's maintaining there's maintaining, it's a closeness that's also distancing in a certain way, articulating. And so one of the things, well, this be interesting if we kind of look at it like this. So like I was right before our conversation, Chris Massapietro and I were going to do a little 5 minutes announcement for the Dialogos that we have coming up in about a month. And it turned out to be like over an hour of us kind of talking about essentially, talking essentially about, well, why would you take it? Why would you do? And essentially, it's this. It's like essentially like what I'm realizing. It's so that you can actually learn essentially how to want the right thing in the right way, right, such that you can leave the cave. And I was in fact, this is really uncanny because we were talking about uncanniness as being a big thing that you become open to, and you start to see more and more of the more that you do this kind of education, right? Which was, and I use this example of this, of like, well, why should you take a weekend and go do these exercises with Guy and Chris and John, right? Like, why would you do that? And I thought of an experience that I had just this last weekend, where I went back to the Bay Area and I went to a party. And right before I left the party, I went outside and just sat down where a bunch of people were sitting, and I kind of struck up a conversation with this person next to me, and was there probably about 45 minutes. We were talking, and essentially the conversation opened up to where she was describing and presencing what it was like to be with her parents the moment of their death, when both of their parents died on the same day in hospice, 9 hours apart. Everything that it took leading up to that, everything from like her receiving the estate, managing the estate is a full-time job, but all the way into articulating, and this is also at the same time, I think, for a backdrop too, of like, I'm going back a lot to Florida. My mom's, having some health things. She's getting older. So there's a way that it hits home for me, but having that moment unreveal or unconceal this thing where I got just the utter profound importance of how important it was for her parents to die with her and her sister looking right at them and with them all the way through, all the way down, right? And because she had described all of this unpleasant stuff, all of this like heavy financial burdens and flying everywhere and all these kinds of things. Like there was very little that was like pleasant about what she described. But when she described that moment, I like recognized that everything was beyond worth it. There was something so fundamental and beautiful about that, and utterly meaningful. And I was like, yeah, this is why you want to take that course, is because on some level, all of the practices that I've been doing all these years necessitated exercising, right, ways of listening, ways of attention, and also wanting, right? Wanting to, like, for example, yearning, craving to know the deepest level of meaning of being. I want to know what that is, right? And nurturing and like wanting that and hungering for it. And all of these things throughout my whole life is just like all those years of practices, such that when I'm not thinking about it, somebody sits next to me and there's a way that I can relate to the universe in that little moment to where it reveals something that profound and that deep that I get to savor in, and I'm educated by it, that simultaneously increases my own desire, inspires me for more, that whole thing. So in some sense, I think there is this, I think it does seem like the education becomes something like practice-based, right? That the practices necessitate, I guess in John's language, like the machinery of transcendence, right? The machinery of, of course, we think that, and I noticed this like in when I train people to learn how to circle, it really does. You're right. It's like it comes down to this. It's the people who actually really get it, are the people that they want it at a deep level. Like they want it not just they want it not just for, like, say, getting better at relationships, but they want what it is to be the kind of being that would want that they want to be the right all the way down to like whatever the deepest level is, that like they have that desire, right? Like that's the thing that has them relate to everything that's happening in such a way that they end up in a very non-linear way becoming masterful at it, right? And this sense of education. So what did you hear in what I said?
I think desire
Seeks to receive miracles.
Mm-hmm.
And we've for too long thought that desire seeks objects. When you sit down, and that was wonderful what you shared, when you sit down and you receive that, there's a certain transformation qualitatively. I've been playing with this word qualitatively instead of just quality or quantity, because like when someone tells you that story and you have this kind of threshold across, you're like, oh, you see it. It's a change qualitative, like in the very experience of what is occurring, and it just snaps out of nowhere, just boom, just like that.
Yeah.
That's a kind of miracle, really, in a way. If we think of a miracle as a kind of changing, if we think of a miracle as beyond cause and effect, as low order understood, a miracle is what kind of unveils that there's an additional cause and effect in reality that you can't see until it happens, but then you know it happened. So I'm using miracle loosely, but it's a word I think gets at what's going on. However, the ability to receive miracles must be conditioned. And that's why it seems to involve practices. So a way I would describe this is it's very similar to beauty. If you want to enjoy Tolstoy, you must meet the condition of being literate. Does that mean Tolstoy is relative and that it's merely taste? No, it's literally the case that you cannot read Tolstoy unless you meet the condition of being literate.
Yeah.
Also, you must meet the condition of having focus. You must meet the condition of not getting bored. You must meet the condition of understanding that there's going to be some digressive parts based on the publication history back then. There are certain conditions you have to meet to be able to be struck by War and Peace in its fullness. Let's say you're not struck by War and Peace in its fullness. Is it the fault of War and Peace? Maybe. Maybe not, though. Maybe there are certain conditions that you could have met to be struck by it.
Yeah.
Let's take Beethoven's Ninth. If you say it's not beautiful and I didn't enjoy it, maybe it's because you didn't meet the conditions of it hitting you in the right way. And I'm not saying there's no element of taste or preference, but there is obviously some degree of conditioning you must meet to receive beauty in its full terms. If you don't say, go to the concert hall where Beethoven's Ninth is being played, you're not going to hear it, right? If you sit in the concert hall and have earphones in, you're not going to hear it, right? Yeah. So it's clear that experience is conditioned by you. You are a live element in the way that experience unfolds to you. And what desire seeks is something of which requires conditioning to receive. And when we as humans don't meet those conditions, desire is still there, but it has to settle on objects.
Yeah.
Because we haven't met the condition for desire to receive miracles or threshold experiences or those crazy kairos moments where you don't know what's going to be said yet, but something is said and you don't know, and these things unfold. What we have to teach are the practices that condition human beings to be able to receive reality in higher forms that are more approaching the miraculous, because that's what desire wants, And if it doesn't get it, it will die, and then you will have a meaning crisis. Layman talked about nutritious experiences. I think that's a lovely phrase. If our experience is not nutritious, desire dies, because what desire seeks is nutritious experiences. It does not seek merely food. That would be an object. It seeks nutritious experience. And what you are able to do, because of dialogos, is you've met the condition for experience to be nutritious and to be there for the person so the experience could be nutritious for them. And it would seem that without dialogos, it is not possible for the human to meet the conditions by which experience can be nutritious in a way that without desire dies. Yes. So this is why it's important to have such training. And also, if you are incapable of nutritious experience, since we relate to people according to what is within us and how we experience, then the quality of our relations will probably be less, because we have not been nutritiously experienced in order to give nutritious experience back to the other, back. And now you have something like a circling that something emergent can occur. These practices are the conditioning that we must go through to meet the conditions so that experience can be nutritious and desire can receive the miracle, a sense of the miraculous that we have desire to seek, that rhetoric honors, discourse kills, and then we need to have classrooms that do not indirectly moralize in engaging in pure discourse that then cuts desire off from the miracle that it seeks, and thus forever has to settle on objects and then eventually gives up and loses motivation to try.
Yes. These qualitative. You're right. It's also kind of a sense of, I think every time you have an experience of this qualitative shift or swish, right, where you're not all of a sudden you're listening and looking at the situation and you realize, whoa, I was not expecting this, and it all comes together and there's this flush of quality unfolding, right? You're right. Then that really becomes something that it's so interesting, because you start to actually desire transformation.
Yes.
That's really what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Which is really interesting, because that's actually like, to desire transformation seems to put you in a different, if we say discourse is essentially about control, it's about like predicting an outcome, being able to respond in such a way, explain everything, right? Kind of left brain control. When you transform something, like, you really are, it's a letting go, right? In a big way, right? In fact, it's a letting go in all the way. It's even letting go of, is it like, because I need to be transformed in order to know why I would want it, I can't even know what I'm wanting. I maybe could just assess, like, am I up for being transformed? Right? It's the best I can do. But if you start to want transformation, you really are wanting, you are starting to want all the things that would be involved in what you're talking about with rhetoric, like a rhetorical sense of the word. Yeah, it sounds like I think that's the thing I'm kind of getting, is that what you start to want are qualities of experience that when you experience them, that they set a precedence for what's possible, right? So in your relationships, like when you're if you have these experiences of really, really deep, profound intimacy in conversation with other people, and you see that that's possible. You may not even know exactly how you did it or how you got there, but that it's there, and that's possible. In some sense, that possible can then inform your dance with the unfolding actuality of talking with the person that you're talking with. That like you can kind of find your way. You can find your way into like start noticing, oh, it's like, oh yeah, when I went left, that decreased something, and if I turn right, it increased something. Right there, there's this whole thing that there's a horizontal referent point. Sounds like the good, something like the good, the way the good works. That, yeah, you're right. It's not an object. It's like, yeah, it's more like it is. It is more like a horizon. And it's funny too. It's like one that, yeah, this is one of the things I noticed when we were developing circling through the years, like, because it was emerging and we were in some sense discovering it more than we were creating it. One of the things that was striking to me was like, even though I didn't know what it was exactly, right? Because I still don't know what the fuck it is, right? It's still kind of emerging in a big way, right? Like, but that there's something, how you know that there's a there is because if you went too far left, you go, that's not it. That's not it. Too far right, that's it. There's something that kind of tells you, it's not like you know, like an object, what you're trying to create or what it is, but there's some evaluative, there's an evaluative, some kind of evaluative meaning contextual structure that has you track when you're closer to it, what gets you closer to it, what keeps you from it. Like there's some kind of tracking that starts to happen in that place. But you're right, it's a qualitative sense of things. It's not wanting a particular object. It is more like wanting to come closer to something, wanting the thing that I can't articulate. That, yes, wanting transcendence, essentially, wanting transformation.
I think you described the sense of the form.
You have a sense of the form and where you need to be to participate in the formulation. And if everything is permitted and you still sense that, well, then that thing you sense must be deeper. It must have a certain depth that is beyond how we traditionally understand everything. It must be the foundation that makes everything possible. And that's why nihilism can actually be a revelation of the form. Because if everything is permitted and yet you still sense when you are in the form and not, then it's a metastructure, it's deeper. And then it's probably more real, like it's real. And that would be suggesting, when you're outside the formulation. Yeah. But you've also done the work to intuit it. And we have a school system that doesn't help people do that work. And so then they can't intuit the form. And so then what? They don't formulate. And then they end up dispersed and lost and meaningless. Well, yes, because without a form, you're meaningless. A form is a meaningful entity, and a meaningful entity has a form. And so if you cannot sense the formulation, then you must have a meaning crisis because you have a sense crisis. I can't sense the form. I can't sense where the formulation is. I can't locate myself. Yeah. Therefore, you cannot formulate. Therefore, you have a meaning crisis because you don't know the meaning of where you are, because you don't know if you're in the form or not. You can't sense your location. You can't sense when you're hitting those guardrails that are the metastructure. And so then you're like, I don't know where I am. And wherever I am, even if it's good, I can't tell. So it's meaningless. If you're in paradise and don't know you're in paradise, then it's meaningless. So you have to have a sense of the formulation. You have to have a sense of the form. Everything you said was really good. Desire does not seek objects. It seeks transformation. Desire is actually a transformation drive. We've misidentified it. Desire is what the human is born with. that is the drive to transform the human into higher qualitative experiences. We've confused it, though, with the desire for objects horizontally, and thus created an economy to provide those objects. Therefore, we've stopped providing the incentive structure for the transformation of the human being, and thus the human has become dull, like a dull knife, and they don't have meaning, and they can't cut through the difficulty of their life. Desire is the seeking of transformation, and that transformation is not merely some lazy, cheap personal transformation where at 40, no, it is a transformation in terms of nutritious experience. It transforms how you experience the human being. If I were to, we also all know this if you're asked directly, it's just that we forget it. If I were to ask you, choose, you can have the biggest house, everything, all the objects, whatever you want, and you not be satisfied, or you can sit on a rocking chair on a porch and be satisfied. Which would you choose? Well, everyone knows the answer is number 2. Everyone knows this. Then why don't we make the entire economy around it?
Yeah.
Like, if we know this, if we know that what human beings seek is a state of an experience where life is fitted and right, then maybe the education system should be about training subjects to be capable of that.
Yeah.
And yet we talk out of the side of our mouth. We say money won't buy happiness and make everything about the accumulation of money. It's a disavow. It's this crazy thing. And the reason we do it, though, the reason we're pathological is because we don't know how to make experience nutritious. If we knew how to do it, if we knew that desire was seeking transformation, then we might stop this pathological doublespeak that we're doing, that we're forced to do because we don't know how to do anything other. Well, maybe if we read the great books and engaged in circling dialogos and would have think these, we would see the alternative. And if we were to change the structure to incubate it, then we wouldn't have to do this double move of saying money isn't everything while making everything about the incentives of money. Yeah. That double strange pathological move we are doing as a Western society is a result of not knowing what desire is, ergo not knowing what demand is. We don't know what these things are. So we have to do this thing where we say, okay, money isn't everything, but if everyone acted like that, the global economy would collapse. So let's talk like money isn't everything, but then make all of the implicit morals of the classroom and society in favor of that so we can maintain demand so the global financial system doesn't fail, all while saying money doesn't buy happiness. It makes no sense. It's a pathological mess. And it basically, I think there's a lot of evidence to show it is not working with things like collapsing birth rates. The Collins talk about that, the stagnation that Cohen's talk about, the income inequality, the reliance of the system on the inflation, devaluation of the currency. I could go on. This pathological mixture doesn't work. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to tell you that it doesn't have to work, because if you go to economic history, it turns out that actually when desire is allowed to seek transformation, you get the great enrichment. Turns out that though we think everything that's been said about transformation and desire, maybe people hear that and say, oh, that's nice, but it's kind of woo-woo. I'm here to tell you that there is a case in economic history to be made that when desire seeks transformation, you actually get more wealth.
Yeah.
That's the joke. If you can make, that's why Belonging Again wants to make that case, because if you can make that case, then anyone who may hear us talk and go, oh, transformation, that sounds nice, but we got to make money, we got to be practical. I'm here to tell you that the great enrichment was a result of transformative thinking, a focus on values and philosophy and talking, that it wasn't a result. The great enrichment didn't happen, which was the increase of the quality of life of the average person on planet Earth by 16 freaking fold, starting in the 1800s. We actually don't realize how much wealth was created in the last 223 years, basically, because we forget that wealth is air conditioning, food, different types of food, restaurants, computers. Like it's called the Great Enrichment. It's a great mystery in sociology and economics, where suddenly about 200 years ago, the amount of wealth created on planet Earth just started to skyrocket. Yes, you had countries like China making gunpowder and innovation, but the amount of innovation, percentage-wise, in around the 1800s, was nowhere close in all of human history. And it turns out what unleashed wealth and innovation and creativity at a scale never before seen in human history was that thing you were told is impractical, ergo rhetoric and philosophy. That thing you were told would never get you a job turns out to be at the foundation of what made everyone on planet Earth a whole lot better off in returns to material well-being. Now, The problem with it is because it increases such an increase in material well-being, we forget what caused it in the material well-being. We say, oh, it was like, we then forget that it was this rhetoric that created wealth, and we think it's money that created wealth. We forget the origin, like Heidegger's forgetting a being, right? And that is where we're now in the meaning crisis, because we've lost sight of the origin of wealth, confused it with the causes, with the effects of that cause, thought the effects are the cause, they're not, and so you have all these pathologies now. If we return to the origin, saw it as rhetoric, and then we were to engage in the practices that condition people to get better at rhetoric, all of them may sound like it would be bad for the economy. No. It would be really good for the economy. This transformation of the classroom is not changing the classroom away. This is the funny thing. We've designed a classroom that's supposed to be good for the economy and made the exact opposite of what would be good for wealth creation. What would be good for wealth creation is something more like dialogos. So, and then the other thing is consumption habits of people would be far more balanced. People would not be like escaping their demons in consumption. And that's where you start getting a balanced consumption that is not destroying the environment or destroying communities, because people are then consuming in light of the conditioning of which makes them open to the mystery and the inevitable in the rhetoric. Therefore, you would have changing and spending habits that would be far more sustainable. You cannot have a sustainable economy that creates wealth unless you have a transformation of the ideas according to which people live. And the change of those ideas can be found in this dialogos, all the things we're talking about on the liminal web. Because to condition the subject is to condition how they consume. And if you change how they consume, you can change the system into something that is more sustainable. And there is a historic case that this is thus, not merely some new notion come up with people in 2023. Arguably, what is being said here is looking at a history that is there for all to see, that if we tap into, we might be able to revitalize today, but we have to do it.
Yeah. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Amazing, my friend. Amazing. But this is we need to talk again very, very soon.
I would love that. I love speaking with you guys. This has been too much fun. I've really enjoyed it, sir.
Digest a lot of I'm probably listen to this and digest it, and then come back and converge some more.
I would like that very much, Guy.
Great
Thank
work.
you, sir.
Thank you. Much love. Mwah.
Much love to you, Guy. Thank you, sir. All the best.